Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored to share some of my work with you. Thank you for Agnes for inviting me, and also PASEO for having me and my collaborators here to show our art, but also to share some of my research with you. I'd like to start by just looking around the room and asking, to show of hands, how many of you have tried AI here? All right, so my estimation is 80% of everybody here. Now, how many of you use it in your work, in your daily, weekly life? Okay, that's give or take about 50%. So as I heard some of my colleagues say, the cat is out of the box. Just how, once upon a time calculators were first, seen as these machines. Well, how are we going to learn math? Now they're part of our education. I think this accessible AI is also kind of heading in that direction. And the difference between AI has been around for several decades in machine learning. I think the difference now that before we needed translators who could do code, who could do the math to interact with AI, now it has evolved to use natural language. And so because most of us are proficient in natural language or other means of communication, we're now able to actually use it more accessibly. And so now that is what is really changing, I think, a lot of our world and why we're having these conversations. And it is changing the way we learn, especially, the more you interact with it, the way we write, it is going to reshape the labor force. And it's, as an educator and professor, I think a lot about what that means for the classroom. But the way I use AI is actually kind of different. It's not about efficiency, but it's about engaging people and creating emotional connections. And that's what I really want to share with you today. It's two projects that I have. One is to connect with the future climate impacts and the climate science. And how do we make that climate science more accessible and relevant to us? And that is part of my academic research. But as an artist, I also have artistic practice that also kind of uses AI, but now in a very different way, in a slower paced way. And I'll talk more about that. And that's the second project that I'd like to share with you about autonomous dancers and the use of algorithms in kind of self-exploration. And if you got a chance to be at PASEO yesterday, you might have seen the autonomous dancer, or maybe you've seen me dance with her. So I'll speak a little bit about that. So let me start by showing you this graph. Has anybody seen this graph? So what you're seeing is kind of the climate change, intergovernmental panel on climate change that is a consensus among world scientists. They produce annual reports, kind of they produce a series of reports gathering all the science of the time and showing us essentially what climate change has. And this is one of the graphs that shows the possible changes in temperature and other global environments. So it's kind of in the science world, it's a very well-known graph. Now, the other question is how does this make you feel? Probably not too much, just numbers, etc. Now I want to ask you, how does this make you feel? So the experience of actually experiencing climate change and being in disaster and seeing the aftermath of a disaster really changes how we view climate impact. It changes the way I think we act, make choices, and for me, it changes the way I do science. So what you're seeing now is the footage that we took following LA wildfires in Altadena, in a formerly vibrant neighborhood that is now essentially ashes and what's remnants of it. And so I think this is really where a lot of the work is kind of being in scientists and artists and a human being in this world is we have the science, or we have a lot of the science, but how do we make the science feel more like this? And for me, this kind of spawned a new avenue of research that I'm pursuing. It's relatively recent because a lot of these AI technologies are recent. So we're all in it together, actually exploring it. We're all new to it. But what I like to call immersive analytics for climate and risk management. And this is a way to use both immersive technology and AI to essentially simulate the science in a very experiential way and make it also available across scales. So this is a prototype of kind of the earlier work that we have done. And we essentially want people, this is my hometown, Vancouver, and we want people to connect with their local community to understand the impacts specifically in their local community and experience the potential future events before they actually happen, to hopefully increase understanding, empathy, and engage in risk reduction or kind of change our collective view. So this is a very early work. I'll show you the more recent ones of an earthquake in Vancouver that gave us kind of the confidence that to pursue this work. That, you know what, maybe this technology will be suitable for that.
The Cascadia earthquake.
So that's an earthquake that hasn't happened yet. But yes, Cascadia earthquake.
So that's
would. So that's I don't know what. That's a hypothetical earthquake. But the idea is like, yes, to connect what a magnitude 9 earthquake in Cascadia would look like in your neighborhood, right? So let me share with you one of the actual pilot projects that we have done, and that is Beyond the Storm. And the idea is to connect residents of New York City with climate and disaster research, and specifically about hurricanes in their neighborhood. And so I'll give you like a slight overview of what is the actual process. Well, first, we use existing science because there is a lot of existing science to understand what is the flooding level, what is the hurricane impacts around New York City. But then going from kind of a map view, a map understanding, the science and the simulations, we ask the question, well, what does it mean for you? And what does it mean for you locally, specifically at the street view level? And we use street view as a mean of communication. So this is, if you've ever been on Google Maps and Google Street View, you can kind of walk around and see 360. That's really the base of our work. Okay, and this is where AI comes in. So then we kind of take that information from the science, we train generative AI, and I will show you what that means in a second. And generative meaning that it generates something new from the knowledge it has seen before. And so we combine those two to produce these hypothetical things that haven't happened, but they are based on things that happened, to kind of get a feeling of what a storm might look like in your community. And so just jumping to what we actually built over the last year and a half of research is a pilot platform, web platform for New York City, where you essentially go in and you type in your address. This is an example, Rockaway Beach, and you wait, and it gives you some information about the previous events there, what hurricane evacuation zone is, kind of relevant information, what is your risk in the future, as it generates the imagery. And what you have is your regular imagery, and then you can also apply this generative AI filter to see what the impacts are. And you can see close to the coast, you kind of have a lot of sand coming out. This is an area around my house that actually is not at risk of flooding that much, but you see the model understanding what the risks are, can kind of depict wind damage that is in the area. And this is because it's using this algorithm, it's very scalable. So you can do this anywhere around the city as long as you have kind of the science behind it and the model and the street view. So those are kind of the ingredients that go into it. So this is one way of doing it. Another way that we're testing is giving greater context and thinking about systems that are impacted. In disaster science, we think about how the entire system works together and is impacted, and we try to convey that. So in this experience, what you're seeing is essentially a narrative about how hurricanes can disrupt the food system. And then because you have all this data, you can highlight how, for example, what kind of food is on your street, how they could be impacted. For example, it shows the Green Comfort Diner. It talks about logistics and the supply chain and what grocery stores might be impacted, to kind of start thinking about these impacts as a system and how we can mitigate them. All right. So what actually happens a little bit behind the scenes? So this specific algorithm uses a baseline, so something that was developed by other scientists, but then trains it, or this process is called fine-tuning, to a specific data set to be representative of what you want to be showing. So what you're seeing here is actually real images of impacts of Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Helene. So events that were relevant to that geography. And over here, if you look across the rows, we're kind of collecting data about different types of damage that can happen. So, for example, flooding and inundation. The second one, I believe, is coastal environments. So what do things look like when you have sand movement? And finally, the building damage on the top. And so these are kind of the concepts that we organize the data in that way and then let the algorithm learn. And here, this is an example of actually, while you train the algorithm, it trains over time. So let's say it takes like a day to actually train the algorithm. And every hour, it will understand more and more and more and more from that data set. And so you can kind of see from left to right the evolution of what it understands the different concepts to be. So let's take, for example, this inundation, so flooding. You see on the left, it doesn't know, we force it not to know that concept. And then as it learns every hour, it starts kind of looking like the pictures that we showed it. And that's how you kind of look and how you can control and how you can evaluate whether your model is giving you what you're trying to teach it. Okay, so now how is this useful? And that's kind of the mechanics behind it, and how can we bring this into community? So we're still at the very start of this work, and we want to be careful about how we bring it in because we want to do it ethically. But we had a first workshop in New York University with a lot of the students reflecting on it. Some of the students and professors who have been through Hurricane Sandy echoed that they did see realism, and it kind of recalled some of their experiences. Some things were distracting because they did look AI and generated, and that kind of detracted from what we were trying to do. But it provoked a central question, is like, what do we actually do to prepare? Because we were just showing them the impacts. And so that led us to our next steps, I think, will be, in order for us to actually cause action or help use that, we don't only show the impacts, but also empower people of like, what can action do? And that's the next part of our work. And this is really very much in line with the theory on what causes protective action. And that's first risk perception, and do you feel a threat? But the second, and I would say even most important part in causing action is, can I do something about it? And if I do something, will it have an impact? So the next stage for us is to integrate that into an experience, of course, based on kind of our understanding of science. And then so that these two collective things can lead to action. And we've also had a chance to actually bring it into a youth program and work with it for them to think about their everyday life systems that they engage with, education, transportation, and then look at it through this lens of hurricanes and think about how they can be impacted and what can be done, kind of do speculative design, what can be done to mitigate that. So this is still very beginning work. And I have a few minutes, right? Okay, so I think sharing, let me give you just an overview of the second part of the work. This is part of my art practice and a project that has been in the making for about a year, 2 years now. And it is to use algorithms to create autonomous beings that we can move with, interact with, perform with. And this project really came from a few questions. One is, what is the role of the artist when creating autonomy and using AI? And maybe we have a chance to discuss this during the panel. And what does that new relationship with autonomous beings look like? And the primary form for this project is movement, so it's not natural language. And this is something we haven't seen as much, is exploration of agents or AI that communicate with you through movement. And so this work is done in collaboration with dancers, where I first engage in long-form interviews with several dancers where I learned about their practice. And then we engage in improvisation sessions that are motion captured. And what that means is you essentially wear the suit where you're reading the data and you're recording the data over the time when I'm dancing, and now it lives in the digital world, right? So you can reproduce kind of the skeleton. And there's a lot of AI that is involved in even this process, but I don't touch that. I use already existing algorithms to do that. So that's the first process, is taking that movement and putting it in the digital world. And so then the tedious process, where I think my role as an artist comes in, is looking through these hours of footage and then dissecting it into a database of movement, of hundreds of moves, putting myself in there, deciding what is meaningful to me, what is not, what resonates with me. And so this is, I think, the role of me as an artist in it, is creating this database of movement. And I just want to acknowledge that this is not a large data project like you would see with a lot of AI. This is a carefully curated data set of 5 dancers, one including myself. That is then I build an algorithm to essentially be able, based on those moves, to generate autonomous choreography. And right here is an example of Nadame, that she's the avatar who I have named, coming from Not Me, who is actually doing the performance. And you can see it all started with the same move, but now it's algorithmically generated and the moves become quite different, and it's essentially an endless choreography. So why make this? What was the purpose of it? Well, the first was actually creating a performance that some of you might have seen.
Flat.
For me, muted. There we go. So this piece specifically was a performance, and it talks about patterns and hopelessness, and then kind of using AI, this virtual dancer, to break out of your own patterns. And I made this during a time where I was going through very deep grief, and it actually did kind of help me at least feel more in my body. So that was a very personal project. Now I have a minute, but it has evolved from there into several installations, several ways for people to interact with her from different point of views, different paradigms, as installations, as workshops for movement, finding new movement. And recently here at PASEO, I'd like to share a few amazing people who have interacted with it, moving in a way that they might not typically move in, because she partially understands their moves, partially does her own thing, and I think that creates a new way for us to communicate. And I just want to wrap up on one last kind of anecdote of this video. So because of the rain, as you saw, a lot of the tech actually wasn't working. We couldn't work it. And so what actually happened is people thought they were dancing with AI, but it was actually me in a suit in the background dancing with them. But I think the most amazing thing about it is that I think if I was standing in front of there, nobody would dance like that, right? There would be this like social constraint and like feeling of judgment, and our social norms would come in. But because it was an AI, it was something abstract, people were just going for it. And I think that gives us a highlight why people share with GPT their deepest secret, why they ask questions they would never ask, not maybe their friends, etc. It's like something about this new relationship I think is worth exploring ethically and in a responsible and safety-oriented way. Okay, thank you for the time.